I'm still set up from doing a podcast recording this morning. So you're getting to see me in all of my full podcast gear for our YouTube episode today. But I wanted to talk with you today about the Huguenots. Now, if you're like me, I recently learned that it is pronounced Huguenot, not Huguenot. And it is the Edict of Nantes, not the Edict of Nantes, as you I don't know, maybe you don't mispronounce things like I do, but sometimes when I read things, I read it one way and then I say it out loud and find out that that's not the way it's supposed to be said. Anyway, this week we're going to look at the history of the Huguenots in Shakespeare's lifetime and ask questions like what kind of impact did their arrival have on the English, and specifically on people like Shakespeare? What archival evidence do we have that shows that Shakespeare interacted with the Huguenots directly? There's all kinds of things to explore on this topic, so let's dive in right now on That Shakespeare Life. So why were the Huguenots coming to England in the first place? Well, that's an excellent question. And the reason is because in France during Shakespeare's lifetime, and certainly before and even after, the government was extremely pro-Catholic. Now, by I don't mean just like they really liked Catholic. I mean, to the point of persecuting and outright slaughtering Protestants. The Edict of Nantes was signed in 1598, and it was designed to ease the tensions between the Catholics and Protestants by granting French Calvinists civil rights and demanding legal tolerance. The government said you have to be nice to the French Calvinists, but essentially it didn't work. And civil wars of religion erupted in France for a long time. Now, the Huguenots were French Protestants, and they were specifically adherents to the teachings of John Calvin. They were unwelcome, to say the least, in France, and things at one point got so bad that the government was rounding up Protestants and slaughtering them with no mercy, just literally dragging them out of their homes and killing them right in the streets. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre alone reported thousands of bodies were gathered up from the Seine River just because they had been murdered and then thrown there and completely discarded disrespectfully, and just it was horrible. So under these kinds of conditions, obviously the Huguenots are unable to live in France, and so they're fleeing France, and the most logical place to go in Europe was England, because England was a Protestant country, and England was kind of one of the few Protestant countries. We have a map, but a lot of Huguenots were leaving France and going to England, which was close by, because they could live there and be Protestant and not be dragged into the streets and slaughtered. When they arrive in England, the Huguenots are known for being skilled craftsmen. They were really great at winemaking. They were also really great at furniture making and just skilled with their hands. And they were very good at turning these crafts and industry specific skills into businesses. And so they would come to England and they would set up shop. They would, not unlike a lot of immigrants to the US today, they come here and they have something they're really good at and they turn that into a business as a way to support themselves. And the Huguenot immigrants into England in the 16th century would do this as well. Now, one Huguenot family, the Mountjoys, even housed William Shakespeare for a time, who lived there as their lodger in London. In case you ever wondered exactly where Shakespeare lived while he was working in the city. Think about it. I mean, it was several days. I think it was up to a week to maybe even 2 weeks horseback ride to and from Stratford. So like to go home took a week, and then to come back to London took a week. And so he wasn't exactly commuting home every day to come work in the city. When he was living in London, he had to have somewhere to live. And we don't have a lot of information about specifically where Shakespeare was living, except for the Mountjoys. Now, we know about Shakespeare living with the Mountjoys because Shakespeare was called as a key witness in a court case in 1604. And apparently, Stephen Belloc got his panties in a twist because he married Christopher Mountjoy's daughter, Mary. And he claimed that Christopher never so much gave him the things that he was promised when he married her. There was like a ring and some money, and I don't know, there was a couple of things. He was very upset about it. He was supposed to have gotten it when they got married, and he didn't. And so William Shakespeare, having lived in the house when all this was going down, he gets called into the case as a witness. Now, his deposition, as court cases do, is written down. So we see exactly what Shakespeare said. And in his deposition, Shakespeare admitted that he had played a role as go-between in the courtship of Stephen Bellet and Mary Mountjoy that the other witnesses in the case described. But when it comes right down to it, Shakespeare says, you know what? I can't remember exactly what the arrangements of the Bellet-Mountjoy marriage settlement were. So basically, he pleaded the fifth. I'm not taking sides here. I don't remember who did what. The court finds actually in favor of Bellet and demands that Mountjoy pay this. The court determines an amount of money, and he says, you have to pay this to Mountjoy. And that's the way it got settled. Now, Mountjoy has the laugh because, as far as we can tell, Mountjoy never seems to have paid Bellet that money. So he just basically said no, and there was no further legal action taken about it that we have record of anyway. Now, what's fun about the documents in this case, however, aside from, mother-in-law jokes that abound there, but that's the one way that we can look into the life of William Shakespeare, because the papers in this court case outline a list of people that Shakespeare would have been acquainted with personally, not only just the Mountjoys, but of course their immediate neighbors. And then George Wilkins is listed. And that's interesting because we think that George Wilkins collaborated with Shakespeare on the play Pericles. And these court documents back up the idea that they knew each other personally. There's also papers that show in 1604 Shakespeare was living as a lodger with the Mountjoys, and that location was located on Silver and Monkwell Streets in Cripplegate, London. And this is the only evidence that we have found so far that tells a particular address that Shakespeare was living at when he was living in London. This evidence is also a key element to understanding the history of the Huguenots in England, because an establishment that they were living in and also running a business out of is a typical arrangement for Huguenot families coming to England as refugees. In fact, the term refugee developed from this movement of the Huguenots coming from France to England. Refugee is a French word, and we have it in English because of this experience that was going on during Shakespeare's lifetime of these French Calvinist exiles leaving and arriving in France. And so they got named refugees, and it went on to become anyone who is fleeing persecution and going to another country to find freedom. Now, when we talk more about the Huguenots in an upcoming episode, I interviewed Joyce Hampton of the Huguenot Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and that is forthcoming. It will be coming out in May. So if you're watching this and it is May, go ahead and click over to the feed there and you should be able to find that. If not, you can subscribe to our podcast at the link below this episode, and you will be notified when the episode goes live. But we go into a lot of detail with her about the history of the Huguenots and the impact that had on Shakespeare. So that's a great podcast episode to check out. Now, if you want something you can watch right now, I have explored the history of St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre specifically, and it is posted, I forget if it's here or there, but anyway, the link is on the screen, and you can explore what happened on that day in particular and how the international crisis impacted Shakespeare specifically. We have evidence from his plays that he not only knew about, but had a very personal response to the goings on in France with the Huguenots. So you can watch that episode to find out more about that. There's also more to be explored here on the Shakespeare Tidbit series I have here on YouTube, and you can watch that entire series at the other link on the screen. But that's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash. Thank you for being here and for exploring the life of William Shakespeare along with me. That's it for this week. I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.